Greetings, Pencrest Science students. This is Mr. Del Prado here, and today we're going to talk about the subject of genetics. So this will be our intro video on genetics. We'll go through basic dominant and recessive genes, and we'll talk a little bit about Gregor Mendel being the father of genetics, and hopefully give you guys an idea as to how to solve some basic genetics problems. So heredity. Heredity is just the passing of traits from parents to offspring. So you can think about something that maybe a trait that you received from mom and dad, that they got from their mom and dad. It gets passed down from one generation to the next. This study of heredity is genetics, and there are some patterns that we can often identify in genetics, and we can actually see how these patterns get passed down from one generation to the next. It's difficult to talk about genetics without giving you some basic vocabulary. A trait is any characteristic that you have that can be passed down, that is inheritable. So for example, Mr. Dell is colorblind. That is a trait. That is a genetic trait that I have. It was passed down from generation to generation, and lo and behold, given to me. A dominant trait or a dominant gene is the gene that is always expressed when that, is the trait that is always expressed when that gene is present. So if you want to think about a dominant trait in terms of like a fight, the dominant trait always wins out. The recessive trait is the trait that only is shown when there's no dominant traits around or present. They can only be shown when there's either both recessive genes or just simply one recessive gene. And we'll talk more about that. It'll make more sense to you when we actually look at some examples of that. An allele essentially is just the alternative form of a gene. You'll oftentimes hear me use the word allele and gene in the same way, but they are a little bit different. You can have a dominant allele, or you could have a recessive allele. You could have two dominant alleles, two recessive alleles. They are essentially just alternate forms of a gene for a particular trait. Gregor Mendel is considered the father of genetics. He was an Austrian monk, and his side interest was looking at the traits of pea plants. Yes, pea plants, the types of plants that actually give you like the pea pod that sometimes maybe you put in a pan, put a little olive oil on them. They taste quite delightful. So look at this. Mendel actually cultivated and tested over 28,000 pea plants, and he was a biology teacher. He certainly had his hand in the sciences as an Austrian monk. And what he did was this, without getting into a whole bunch about the sexual reproduction of plants, what he did was this. Pea plants reproduce sexually. And what he did was he was able to take the ovum of one pea plant and take the pollen from the same pea plant, and he could make the pea plants self-fertilize. That means sexual reproduction with itself. I know, creepy and weird. But he could then take the pollen, which is essentially the male sex cell, and the ovum, which is the female sex cell, of the same plant, and he could selectively breed these plants. Cross-pollination is when one plant fertilizes another completely separate plant. Self-pollination or self-fertilization is when a plant fertilizes itself, and in fact this can happen in plants because they have both the male and female sex cells, not so much in humans. So what he did was he took purple flowered pea plants, and he took the pollen, the male sex cell, and then he also took the ovum, the female sex cell of purple plants, and he self-fertilized them. And lo and behold, when he self-fertilized them, the offspring were purple. And then he took those offspring and he self-fertilized them. And then the offspring of those plants were purple. And he did this for multiple generations. So he created essentially a true breeding strain of purple plants. And then he did the same exact thing by self-fertilizing white plants as well. So he would take the pollen, mix it with the ovum for a white plant. They would have white offspring. Then they would take the pollen and the ovum. And so then what we ended up having is a pure purple plant and a pure white plant. So this idea is called selective breeding. That is breeding for particular traits. And in humans, right, we do this all the time. We selectively breed dogs for particular traits that they have. I put the one down there at the bottom because it's currently an argument in the Del Prado household. Those are the cotton candy grapes, right? They clearly are selectively bred. You don't see cotton candy grapes out in the wild. Mr. Dell, not a huge fan of the cotton candy grapes, but others in my family are. But you know, you taste the grape, it should taste like a grape, not like cotton candy. But I digress. So anyway, this idea of selective breeding has been around for thousands of years. And this is what Mendel did. So if you look at the P here, that means a parent. The F1 and the F2, F1 means first filial generation, but another way to think about it is it's your kids. The F2 generation is the second filial generation. It's the same thing as grandkids. So look what he did. Finally, after he self-fertilized those pea plants, he had a pure purple plant and a pure white plant. And then he finally mated them together, a purple plant and a white plant. And lo and behold, look what he got with the kids. When he got all of the offspring, when he mated the purple and the white plant, all of the offspring were purple. All right. So this does beg the question then, right? Why did this happen? Where did the white go? You would think that maybe if you had a purple plant and a white plant, they would have all lavender kids, right? A light purple. But that wasn't the case. They ended up being 100% pure purple. Then what he did, he allowed the children to self-pollinate. And when they did, right, then they had grandkids. Those grandchildren or those offspring, there was the purple plants, but then the white plant reappeared. You might remember mom and dad saying something to you like, hey, that trait skips a generation. Well, in this case, look, the white plant, it actually did skip a generation. It was gone in this generation and then it reappeared in the next generation, but it was essentially always this 3-to-1 ratio of purple plants to white plants. So we would get the white plant, but only about 25% of the time. Mendel did this for many other traits on the plants, including the position of the flower, the height of the plant, the pea color, the shape of the pea and whatnot. But I'm going to stay focused on the color of the plant because it's an easy way for us to realize or to recognize what actually is going on when he mated these things together. So again, he did a whole bunch of these traits and looked at a whole bunch of different ones. But when we look at the purple flower compared to the white flower, okay, the purple flower appeared in that first generation in all of the children. And then it appeared 75% of the time in the grandkids. The trait that appeared 100% of the time in the regular kids and 75% in the grandchildren, he called that trait dominant. And in this case, the purple plant was dominant to the white plant. The plant that disappeared in the first generation but reappeared in the second generation, that trait is called recessive. So in this case, it was a white plant, or the white color flower was recessive. So Mendel came up with a few ideas that we now know are directly related to DNA, but he didn't know that at the time. What Mendel claimed was that you get a genetic particle, we now know it's a gene, right, from mom and dad. When you have a particle where one of those genes, if it's there, you get that trait. So for example, let's say that you get 2 genes for flower color from mom and dad. If even just one of those genes is a purple gene, purple will be shown. That's the dominant trait. But remember that most of our cells are diploid, so you get a trait from mom and from dad. So let's say that you get a dominant trait from mom and a recessive trait from dad. Well, that still is going to show the dominant trait. The only time that you would get a recessive trait is when you inherit both recessive alleles or both recessive genes, one recessive gene from mom and one recessive gene from dad. Okay? What we will do then is we're going to spend a fair amount of this unit looking at the genes that you got from mom and the genes that you got from dad. Those genes, when we put them together, like let's say that you're a pea plant and you got a dominant gene from mom, we'd make that a capital P, and you got a dominant gene from dad, and that's a capital P. Hey, you're a purple plant. The letters that signify your genes are called a genotype. What you are in terms of your trait or your physical appearance, that's called a phenotype. If you get two of the same genes, like a dominant gene from mom and a dominant gene from dad, or a recessive gene from mom and a recessive gene from dad, you are said to be homozygous, two of the same genes. If you get a dominant gene from mom and a recessive gene from dad, or you could flip it, a recessive gene from mom and a dominant gene from dad. If you have two separate genes, one's dominant, one's recessive, you're said to be heterozygous. These terms, homozygous and heterozygous, are going to come up again and again in this unit, so it's kind of important to know. Homozygous, two of the same genes, either two dominant or two recessive. Heterozygous is when you get one dominant gene and one recessive gene. Okay? So if we go back to Mendel's flowers then, here's what we ended up getting. Here were the genotypes, okay, of the purple flowers. If you had two dominant genes, you were purple. If you had a dominant gene and a recessive gene, you were still purple. But if you inherited two of the recessive genes and there was no dominant genes present, then you would end up being white. Okay? So in this case, and I know I have purple with a W there, how about we change that? In this cross, then purple would be dominant to white. All right, so the difference between dominant and recessive. The dominant gene is the gene that is generally shown. The recessive gene can only be shown if there are no dominant genes present. If you're homozygous, you have two of the same genes. If you're heterozygous, you have two different genes. Okay? Genotype are the letters that signify what genes or alleles you have. The phenotype is your physical appearance. So I hope that makes sense as to the where we get the letters from and the basic terminology and vocabulary. Obviously, our next step is going to be to look at these terms, look at these characteristics, and apply a Punnett square so that we can predict what offspring will look like. But we'll be doing that next time. So I'll see you on the other side, and thanks for listening.